Hello and welcome back everybody. Today we're going to do the real minimum requirement to play Marvel Rival. If you remember, the minimum requirement proposed is the i5 6600K. This is a 4-core 4-thread CPU. The Ryzen 5 1600X. This is a 612. The GTX950. My guess is the 3GB or 6. Who knows? The RX 580. My guess is probably the 4GB variant, and the ARC A380, which is only in 4GB variant. Welcome to Response PC. I'm Dunk. Let's game on. I'm going to start up with the AMD side. So the lowest Ryzen that I have is the Ryzen 3 1200. We're going to use 16GB of RAM because we saw on the proposed minimum requirement we always at 10 and over of system memory usage. And I'm going to start with the RX 570 4GB variant. At 1080p with everything at default, I mean it's at low, with TSR Epic at quality and Frame Gen 3 enable. This gives us an average FPS of 67. This is highly playable. I don't see much artifact going on with Frame Gen enable, which is quite nice by itself, but GPU is not maxed out, running at 76% of utilization, 3.6 of VRAM. Even the CPU is in the 70% of utilization, and we're still using 12GB of system memory, so we can probably get lower almost everywhere. And if you're not a fan of frame generation, you can disable frame generation 3. That will actually drop our FPS to the 46, pushing the GPU utilization to the mid 80, still not at 100%, and the CPU didn't change much. Same go for the system memory. Time to drop the GPU. Now for the RX 560 4GB variant, not the 2GB one, still with the Ryzen 3 1200 and 16GB of RAM, 1080p TSR Epic at quality without frame generation, an average of 32 FPS. This is playable, but since this is a hero shooter, which the FPS is more important, it's your call to say if it's playable at over 30 FPS. I was able to play without any issue, with highs of 36 FPS and low as 28. It was stable enough for me to obliterate my enemies, but it's not 60 FPS for a shooter. But if you're on a budget and you don't care 30 FPS, RX 560 it is. I've also tried just FSR instead of TSR, and we get an average of 22 FPS. This is unplayable. But if you use FSR with Frame Gen, you get an average of 36 FPS, becoming a bit more playable than TSR. But you can also enable frame generation with TSR. So I say stay with TSR and Frame Gen, your call if you want to use it or no. I also want to try the R9 380, which is also a 4GB card, but we have a warning that the driver is too old. For Nvidia it's the 53699, AMD the 23121, and the Intel 5333. And even if you still want to launch the game and ignore the notice, you get a DX12 is not supported on your system. Trying running without the DX12 or D3D12 command argument, which I did try, but the game didn't want to launch either way. Maybe there's more technical way to go around and force a DX11 or Vulkan, but that's not a video about that. Next up, we jump to Intel CPU and Nvidia. I was going to try also ARC, but every of my ARC card cannot launch the game. I'm crashing every time. So for now, I'll stay with the Nvidia GPU. For the Intel, I went with the i5 4670, still a 4-core 4-thread, and the GTX950 Ti. This is a 4GB card. You will see later why I didn't choose a 2GB VRAM card. So first off, we are at 1080p, TSR Epic at quality, and everything at low settings. We get an average FPS of 44 without any frame generation. If you want your 60 FPS plus, you're going to have to enable Frame Gen 3. GPU utilization is in the high 80 to mid 90s, sometimes dropping in the 70s. Using 3.6GB of VRAM out of 4, the CPU is quite good in the mid 70s, and for the system memory we are at 11 to 12GB. Next up on the same system, I have the GTX960 4GB variant. This is on paper, even if it's older, a little bit more performance than the GTX950 Ti, of about 10 to 15% better, even though it's older than the GTX950 Ti. But the 900 series probably going to be the lowest you can go, as it supports DX12 and the driver is 53699. So we go with the same setup as the 1050 Ti, 1080p, low settings, TSR Epic at quality, and Frame Gen off. We get an average of 38 FPS, 2 more FPS than the 1050 Ti. And again, if you wanted to get over 60 FPS, you're gonna have to enable Frame Gen. Now keeping the GTX 960 but dropping the CPU drastically, the i7 920. We now have a 4-core 8-thread CPU instead of 4-core 4-thread, but we drastically drop our gigahertz at 2.66 instead of 3.4. But it seems the number of core/thread help a little bit. for the low gigahertz of this CPU, because we have a lower average CPU utilization than the i5 4670. The GPU is the same and the setting is the same, 1080p, TSR peak, low settings, frame gen off. But we get an average FPS of 40. We get a little bit more FPS, still in the margin of error because we're not in the same map as the test with the i5, but still nice to see that the old in gold i7 920 first gen can still play this kind of game. And for the 2GB card, I tried the GTX 950 with the i7 920, but to be able to have a decent FPS, you need to have frame gen enabled, and every time I enable the frame gen in game, I've crashed. I was never able to finish a match. But if you disable frame gen, the game won't crash, but the FPS will be horrible, because the 2GB card without frame gen, we get an average of 20 FPS. This is horribly playable, and doesn't matter if you push from quality, balance, performance, or ultra performance for the upscaling, you'll get a maximum of 28 FPS average. I've also tried the GTX 1050 non-Ti, which is a 2GB card, and the GTX 750 Ti, which is also a 2GB card, and in all situations wasn't able to get over 30 FPS. You really need a 4GB VRAM card or higher. Tell me in a comment if you're using a 3 or 2GB card and was able to play with a decent FPS. I'll be happy to hear your story. So our winner for the real minimum requirement to play Marvel Rival for the CPU side is the i7 920 or the Ryzen 3 1200. For the GPU we have the GTX 1050 Ti or the RX 560 4GB variant. Unfortunately, I cannot test the A310 or the A380 from Intel because the game crashes every time I try to use them, so this will be for another video. But for our runner, those CPU and GPU are my results. Thanks for watching, see you in the next one, and subscribe!